First, I'd like to introduce Tony Sager. Tony Sager is the Chief of the Vulnerability Analysis and Operations Group at the National Security Agency. And he's actually in the other room for those of you here in the Palace Ballrooms. Part of the group's mission is to identify, characterize, and put into operational context vulnerabilities found in the technology, information, and operations of the DoD and the national security community at large, and to help identify countermeasures and solutions. Mr. Sager is also quite active in the public network security community. He's in his 29th year with the NSA, all of which he has spent in the computer and network security field. And with that, we'd like to ask Tony to take it away in the Augustus Ballroom.
Good morning, Black Hat. It's a pleasure to be here. It really is an honor. It's my first time ever coming to Black Hat. I've been to Windows Black Hat. I was a speaker there several years ago, invited by Jeff Moss to come talk about the work that my group does at NSA. I'll try to explain a little of the context and some of the interesting things that we're doing. I've got this interesting title. I hope it's interesting to you. Creating Value from Vulnerability. So let me tell you a little bit about the work that my group does, the way we have shifted the manner in which we do this work over the last few years. And there's a couple themes that I'd like you to kind of pay attention to. One is the notion of change within government bureaucracies, which is, those are not oxymorons. It can happen, but it's not always easy. Second, though, is about the network security business as a whole and the need to work together as a community to bring solutions to the table. So the time has come when we're living in this chaotic network, and lots of problems are out there. We've got to figure out how to solve these problems at scale. So a lot of this is a sort of storytelling to illustrate these kinds of themes. And as the intro mentioned, I'm actually about 1 month shy of 30 years at the National Security Agency. And I'll be celebrating that time, and I really mean it. I'll be celebrating because I've had such a great career, a lot of great opportunities to work with really fascinating, talented people dedicated to the cause, and then be a part of a larger community much like this one. And the interesting thing about my career is I spent the entire 29-plus years of it in kind of the computer security business, in the defensive mission at NSA. When you think of NSA, I know you're not thinking of what I do, but that's where I've spent my career, in through computer and information security. And of that 29 and 11/12 years, it's always been about being a vulnerability finder. So my role has always been sort of like red teaming, looking at both the emerging technology for vulnerability, but also involved in the last several years, 10 years or so, in operational testing. So going out to the field to see what's really happening. And boy, it's great work if you can get it, right? And many of you are involved in a similar kind of work. It's fascinating technically, it's on the bleeding edge, and lots of opportunity for creative kind of work in it. But, for context, the professional world that I started in, late 70s at NSA in 77, dramatically different security problem. Right? It was a government monopoly business. It was really the government that cared about security. And the research money was really driven by the government, and what constituted the problem and how we would solve it was really a government monopoly business. And our primary business, when I came on board as a junior vulnerability finder type, was the primary business of NSA, the protection mission, was producing things, link encryptors and voice scramblers and things like that. Okay, things that would go out in the environment and protect against a particular kind of a threat. Our primary concern was over protection of the information, usually in transit, right? So we call it confidentiality today. And the kind of work that I was involved with was really the stuff that you did in the back room. It was the analysis so that we made good choices as we designed things and built them. So a dramatically different world. And at that time, the government not only sort of dominated this problem, but owned this problem, could control the technology, could postulate what the bad guy looked like, and could, in fact, pay for the technology that would solve this problem. Right? So in today's terms, we might say, well, we would just design away the risk. We would take the problem and just overwhelm it with sort of the government's intellectual property and with money. Those days have disappeared, as we all know, right? A much more complex world. We all share this world. I mean, the thought that all of us would be sharing the same network with good guys and bad guys and my kids and everybody in the world was really not thinkable in the late 70s. It wasn't the way we thought of communications. So a much more challenging problem. And so you go from protecting things, data in transit, to protecting not only the data, but information around it and the IT that supports it, and then the mission that we're trying to achieve, particularly the Defense Department, that uses this information technology. So a much more intriguing, challenging, and much more dynamic problem. And that's the world that we collectively live in today. And it's a problem in a solution space that's shared by all of us. There's just no escaping that this is really a shared problem. Okay, so this works, yeah. So some of the conclusions that we struggled with in terms of culture change at NSA over the last few years, right? So these are some of the things that we've talked about, taken some action on, some successful, some not. But when you think about this complex, worldwide, interconnected problem, shared among all of us, it comes down to less focus on what the government builds uniquely, much more focus on the improvement of the security of commercial technology. It's just inevitable. You have no choice but to be worrying about security of commercial things. The government can't solve this problem, doesn't own this problem, can't put the boundaries around the problem. And I've come to think of this problem over the last 10 years in particular as a problem of influence. So when you're a monopoly and you can tell people what to buy and what to build and how to use it and so forth, that's a really different problem than when you're in this much messier, less controlled world. So I've come to think of it, and I'll speak much more about this, as a business of influence. That is, how do you create things that will change people's behaviors, that will empower them to do the right things security-wise? And I think of these categories of stakeholders. I'll explain that in just a second. And then for us, a shift from this, remember I said in our early days we built things. And the knowledge was the stuff we did in the back room, so we built clever things. And the business model has really shifted over the last few years. The knowledge of what's vulnerable and what to do about it and how to operate your IT more safely is becoming the output of our business. And the things we build are the legacy boat anchors and things that aren't fast enough or powerful enough or quick enough for the kind of decisions that people make every day about their information. And then this notion of a more dynamic operational focus. So what we really cared about in the late 70s and 80s was about building things, and we put them out there. And if it broke, we'd fix it. And if we found a flaw, we'd fix it. But we weren't really involved as much as we are today in the operational environment, particularly supporting the military. So today, we are in the game. We are in the fight, and much more directly involved in the security of operational networks supporting high-risk missions around the world today. So a really different flavor and a different set of skills that's really emerged in the last 10 years. So as we've looked at these forces that are shifting us and affect every one of you, about a year ago, my boss is the mission director for information assurance at the National Security Agency, and he decided to start a new group. And what he did was combine the elements of old groups. Okay, so I mentioned the work I've been doing is 3 decades old, and it's at least 2 decades older than I am in terms of mathematical cryptanalysis. So this sort of root, fundamental, what are the core concepts that underlie security? Put all those people in an organization, along with all the people doing the operational testing, so red teams and blue teams, that kind of work, brought them all together into one group called the Vulnerability Analysis and Operations Group. So I've already revealed to you, I've never had a different job in my entire career. That's where I've spent my entire time. So I'm really, really honored and humbled to have the chance to lead this group. And it brings together, for the Defensive Mission NSA, all the folks that are the vulnerability finders, the people that worry about this stuff for a living, and then try to translate it into action. And one thing I'll point out to you, the way we think of this vulnerability business, when you're thinking about this at a national level, right, it's not an IT problem, it's not a software problem. It's a comprehensive, full-spectrum problem. So vulnerability is to be found everywhere in the environment, not only in the IT, but in the protocols, but in the physical environment and the signal environment, and in the way the military conducts conducts operations, we make ourselves vulnerable. So we think of it as sort of full-spectrum vulnerability finding. And so I won't bore you with a wiring diagram, but if you look at my organization internally, it reflects all that. The full range of skills that are really part of this national cyber security problem. And then people with all the technical disciplines that you could imagine being thrown at this problem all work in there. So lots of people with really exciting, intimidating, and really high-end skills. And, so we started this new group, again, elements of which were at least 40-plus years old and others of which were fairly new, like the operational security testing. And brought together this group, VAO. Okay, I admit it, I'm a lifelong technocrat. So you have to have a vision statement because we have to have a vision statement. And so here we got a vision statement. They're a dime a dozen unless you pay a consultant, which I guess they cost a lot more than a dime. This is ours. Vision statements are what you make of them. And we spent a lot of time thinking about this one. So I'm just going to point out a few words to you and tell you what they mean to me. So capable. And I think the nation's most capable. Okay? And I think most of you would grant NSA is a pretty technically capable organization. But capability is not just technical capability. It's also about what I'd call mission capability. The ability, the power to deliver those skills at the right time with useful things in the context of other people's problems, right? Solving other people's problems. That leads me to influence. As I said before, and I'll walk you through an extensive example, this is a business now of influence, of how you cause things to change at scale, across a much broader community. And then trusted. I didn't hear anybody laugh when the NSA guy said trusted, so I really appreciate you giving an open mind to this one, because that's not what you always think about. But trusted is about behavior, right? The way you behave in this community. And what really started to emerge a few years ago, people are not really impressed that we're a government agency. They really want to know how you behave, what you bring to the table. And I call it what's the content that you bring to the discussion, right? So I can't say trust is not something you declare. It's something that you earn based upon the way you behave. And so I hope you'll see through my examples that we changed the way we behaved in order to bring more of an openness and bring more specific content to this community. Part of that was to make a statement about the role that we thought we ought to play, and part of it was to enlist other people's help to help us solve this problem. So trust is a big part of this. And, this is still, it never ceases to astound me, and I've been in this business for 30 years, that it's still a relatively small community. So I bet I could talk to any person out in this room. We could play kind of a degrees of freedom game, and I bet within 2 or 3 we'd find a hit, right, on some product that you are involved with that is being used by my customers, or that my folks have tested in the lab, or I guarantee there's some connection. And we almost, every person I talk to, very quickly we find some friend in common, some product in common, some security issue that we're dealing with. And that's kind of the nature of this business. It's a really exciting part of this. But trust is what drives a lot of this behavior. Do you trust the people that you're dealing with? And this notion of actionable information, just real quickly. When I started in this business also, you could make a great living just by poking holes at other people and pointing out their problems and doing red teams and coming up with infinite lists of problems. And if you were really generous, you'd sort them high, medium to low, or something like that. And the time has come for folks in my business to think about how do we translate vulnerability knowledge into action, right? Because we're not going to, in something like the Defense Department or the intelligence community or the U.S. government, you don't solve this problem one network at a time. You don't solve this problem one vulnerability at a time. You don't solve it one product at a time. It's just too vast and too dynamic. So you have to say, well, what is it we're learning from all this that can change the entire game, that we can leverage across scale? Well, that kind of knowledge is going to come from folks like the people in this room, right? From the vulnerability community, the people that really live and breathe this stuff. Okay, so I mentioned to you, I think a lot about stakeholders, and this is the way I've come to think of the problem. I have to take a management class once a year, whether I want to or not. This is my way of thinking about issues of strategic thinking and so forth. And as I said, we have moved from a government monopoly on the security problem to a community problem. And one of the challenges with a defensive business is that there are so many stakeholders in it, and you can't separate it out from the purchasing and the oversight and the operation of IT and the policies that govern us. So it has moved from a technology-focused problem to a really comprehensive problem. And so I've come to think of all the stakeholders involved in this in these 5 categories. You can read them. And there's no rocket science, there's no management deep thought. It's just the way that I think of this problem. And the challenge is, so if you're going to change the world of information security, you're going to have to change lots of things across this full spectrum of folks. And the challenge for folks like me in this business is that every one of those categories thinks of the security problem really differently, number one. And number two, they each speak a different language. All right, so a lot of you folks speak the language of vulnerability and technology. And, again, that's kind of the way the business evolved. And you'll get a lot of blank stares from folks who don't live and breathe what you live and breathe, right? You are among the practitioners, right? The people that live security, and we talk about this. But buyers typically don't speak your language. System operators typically don't speak your language. Policymakers certainly don't speak your language. Lots of folks. So the way to think of this in terms of national strategy is how do we create content that is in the language of these other stakeholders. So I'm going to walk you quickly through an example. It's about 6, 7 plus years in the making. Now, a couple things to remember about this example, right? No one designed this example ahead of time. This is the way the story evolved. I'm going to cartoon it a little bit. It wasn't quite as linear as I'm going to tell it, but it's pretty close. And if you'll pardon me, it's good enough for government work in terms of telling the story. But it's really the way that this has evolved. And again, think of the themes, illustrating community behavior, changing the activities of government bureaucracies. So practitioners. So kind of the way the story began. Say late 99, 2000, somewhere in there. NSA, my center at NSA, had one of our missions of my center. I was the chief of something called the System and Network Attack Center. Despite the ominous name, we were really the good guys. one of our jobs was the blue team, the NSA blue team. And it was a group that would come out, work cooperatively with system administrators in the DoD. And kind of the usual stuff. You all know what this is, right? Scanning and configuration analysis and so forth. What can we do? Where are you vulnerable? What can we do about it? And as a byproduct of that work, we'd produced a very successful security guide for Windows NT, we called it at the time. And it was kind of a function of the time, right? There were actually many of these things floating around. We actually did a count of this, by the way. There were like 14 of them in the U.S. government, sponsored by various agencies at various points. And for us, it was both a training vehicle, it was a giveaway thing, it was kind of a benchmark, and it was just something we could give to customers, even whether we could visit them or not. And it started to take off. It got fairly popular. We kept it current. And eventually became adopted by DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, as their STIG, if you know what that is, a Security Technical Instruction Guide, I think. But it became the benchmark for DISA. And so about that time, Windows 2000 started to emerge as a new concern for the Defense Department. What are we going to do about Windows 2000? How can we roll it out? In particular, what are we going to do about operational security? How should we configure it for security? And when I say, the DoD makes a decision, remember that there is no single, unified, completely managed entity called the DoD, right? It's a very big, complex confederacy of all kinds of issues around IT ownership and policies. And it's very complex. So it's always a mistake to say the DoD did this, but I'll say that for cartoonish purposes. So we looked at this, and my team showed up one day, and they said, Tony, this Windows 2000 thing's a lot bigger than this NT. And we're not sure that we could put together a credible security guide for Windows 2000 and keep it current over time. Right? Because one of my sayings is, if you're in the security guidance business or the security advice business, you're in it forever. Right? You have to be prepared if you're supporting operational users. If you're going to be the advice giver, you got to be there for them for the operational lifetime of that technology in their environment. That is very challenging in something as complex as the DoD, which still has, I'm sure, Windows 98 machines and things like that running around out there. So it's very complex. So our team comes up and says, Tony, we're just not sure we could do this. And so I thought about it for a few seconds, and we talked about it. And I said, fine. Let's make a list of everybody in the U.S. government that has something like this, a Windows NT security guide, and let's call them up and see if they want to work together. See if we can share labor, split the load, do something together. So we literally made a list. I think it was in the mid-teens. We started calling, and here's one of the secrets of government life. Some of you will know this story. That list of 14 had evaporated by the end of an afternoon as we called around trying to find the points of contact. So what had happened? Organizations, people had been reorganized out of existence, funding had disappeared, maybe they adopted our guide or the DISA STIG or whatever happened. That list of 14 just kind of evaporated. And left standing at the end were our friends at DISA. I think Navy SPAWAR was still involved at some level. And that was kind of it. And I said, well, that's not a lot of help. With all respect to my friends at DISA, we need more than this. I think I'll call SANS up and see what they're doing, because they had this Windows NT step-by-step guide. And this was consistent with a belief that was starting to come to me at the time. I said, well, why is this Defense Department problem any different than the rest of government problem, any different than the rest of the country's problem? I'm not sure I can find any difference. So maybe we can find a way to take advantage of that, right, to work together across these communities. And I talked to them, and then there was a little nonprofit starting up called the Center for Internet Security. Kind of in the same business, kind of in the same business, but very focused on the commercial side of this. And security benchmarks was their term for something like this. And out of that, the several conversations and meetings to kind of, put all the wizards in the room and sort through, I believe you should set this registry key to that, and blah, blah, blah. One of the great challenges and exciting things about this business, right, it draws really, really bright, really, really opinionated people who will fall on their sword for the last registry setting and, and so forth. So getting everybody past that was quite challenging. And I call it's a classic exercise in herding cats. Right? All these cats in a room, and they're all really bright, and they all have strong opinions. But at the end of the day, we emerged with what we call the consensus for Windows 2000. I wrote an open press article that's floating around on the web, and I'll give you a link later if you're interested. But to explain from NSA's perspective, why did we move in this direction and why we thought it was important. That came out in 2000 or so. And so, but the idea was, let's organize the practitioners. That's the bottom line. Go find the folks like us. Go find the folks that have a similar mission. And if you can't convince yourself that you have a dramatically different problem, then why not work together and solve that problem together, right? So it was gathering folks like this up into a room. And once we got the technical peers to look at each other, frankly, most of us were too embarrassed to fall on our sword for that last registry setting, the bottom line. right? And recognizing that we had a common problem, whether it was the community that NIST serves or SANS or the Center for Net Security or DISA or us, guess what? We all have the same constituency, and we all need to work together to solve it. So really exciting things started to happen once we thought of the problem differently. Let's gather the practitioners. And I did not use that word at that time. And, of course, users, one of the fascinating things was we each brought our own constituency, people who followed our advice, some because they had to, because it was mandated, and some because they chose to for whatever reason. And you don't have to trust NSA, you can trust NIST or whatever. But my goal was to try and bring those communities together because it just struck me as really odd, so why would my customers have to sort out, do I trust the NIST guys more than the NSA folks, more than the DISA folks? That doesn't make sense to me. Why don't we band together? We don't have enough resources. Anyway, any of us, let's work together. Users start to really adopt this stuff in force now. And it became, some people, NIST had their constituency again, CIS, others. Everyone brought their game to the table. But it became kind of an accepted practice, right? I'm going to operate my clients. I'm going to do it this way. And another thing started to emerge, which is some of the big buyers that I would speak with regularly, like at that time the CIO of the Air Force, said, well, if we're going to operate our systems to this, why don't we buy it that way to start with? Why don't we tell the vendor this is the way we want it configured? Right? Think of something as vast as a DoD. Does it really make sense in terms of network security for us to ship wide open, unconfigured for security, all our OSs and applications and hope that every poor slob, undertrained, underloved, under-resourced person at the tail end of the food chain is going to take this and secure it from scratch? Is that a sensible way to tackle something on scale? Of course not. And you're not going to train everybody in the DoD to be a wizard like this community. Right? There just aren't enough of us out there. So it makes sense, ship it that way to start with. So a story is starting to build now, right? Get the practitioners to agree on what constitutes rational security practice. Users start to see this as a useful thing to do. Buyers start to see this as, well, wait a minute, why don't I get this up front? And if there's any Air Force folks in here, you don't have to identify yourselves, but the Air Force has really taken this on nationally and done a great heroic job. So why didn't people do this before? Because applications break, right? You tighten security, bad things happen. And you have to look yourself in the eye, enterprise-wide, and say, boy, I'm going to have to throw away some of these old applications. I'm going to have to spend money to rewrite them. I'm going to have to tell my vendor that it's got to run in this environment. There's some painful choices to be made, and the Air Force has really paved the way on this as a leadership activity for the nation, really making this work. And it works so well that the DoD has done this. So we've worked very closely as the primary advice givers, and we're doing this cooperatively with DISA and with NIST and other friends in this business. But our primary support has been to the Air Force to turn this from Air Force standard to DoD standard. And if you follow the press in this over the spring, you know that OMB, the Office of Management Budget, has mandated this as mandatory for all government agencies. So how did that happen? It's because of folks like my folks and the DISA folks and the NIST folks and the Air Force all getting together and figuring out how we're going to solve this problem at scale. And the key to this was, us, the security geeks, not talking about vulnerability so much, start to talk about registry keys and, operational safe practice and so forth. Create something in their language. And then for the buyers, it was about creating something that they could put into RFPs. Oh, okay, I can tell the vendor to deliver it this way, and I can have an acceptance test for that, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then, of course, you've got the attention of the suppliers. Once you have the buyers thinking this way, the suppliers have to deal with this, right? So you've got the OS vendors, you've got the application vendors. They have to step up and say, okay, I got it. That's the way you want it. And rather than have those NSA geeks at the when I ship the product, make all kinds of bad assumptions about why we did it this way and how the technology works, maybe we should just work with them up front. Let's work with them up front so they got the right information, and we can tell them, we get to see a lot of the breakage issues because we support our customer base, so the big vendors say, as they do. And so working with the security community up front to deliver better operational practice in the form of the shipped product becomes the new model, right? The vendors see that. Another market started to appear, though, partly through encouragement and personal lobbying, and partly because people saw this. So people see large numbers of buyers kind of adopt this practice from NIST or CIS or whatever. And they look at this and they go, oh, well, if people think that's good, well, I've got a scanner or a tool that works in their environment. It's no big deal for me to tweak the tool so that it measures compliance against these standard benchmarks. Okay, so that's a good thing. So I'll just tweak the tool and give them a little added value here. I can tell you want to run your clients the NIST way or the NSA way or your servers the way CIS says, No problem. I will add that to my tool. So that market has really started to emerge and become kind of the way we think of this problem. And then I mentioned earlier OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. So people who have oversight, right? So they want to regulate or mandate solutions to the security problem. So they look at this activity and they say, oh, well, this is good. So I want all government agencies to do this because I'll get some sort of known security property out of it. I'll get some value from it. And I can streamline it. I can have a single buy for it. I can make this mandatory, et cetera, et cetera. And a key role that NIST has played in this, if you follow the press on this, there's a program called I'll mention it a bit later, the Security Content Automation Program. It's technically a tri-sponsored thing between us, DISA, and NIST, but it's really homed at NIST. And it bundles up a number of these ideas together and specifically links it to FISMA compliance. Right? So the idea is that, okay, if this represents best practice, how should I operate my IT? Well, I want that linked to oversight things like FISMA that say, I expect you to handle data responsibly, including down to the controls on your IT. Right? So it takes away this wild west of, kind of good intention oversight with uber geeky kind of how do I operate my IT and tries to build a linkage there in a very specific way. And the goal is to dramatically cut the cost of compliance. That is, why do I create a lot of paper to make this mapping? Why don't I build a framework that says, well, if you obey these standards, then you will be in the right direction. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Okay, so stakeholders. So this story starts to build up. Again, the key was to think about it in sort of different terms, in terms of how do we create content differently than we did before. So we didn't design this ahead of time, but the story that's really built a tremendous amount of momentum up over the last year in particular. Now, what was happening behind the scenes that's a little more technical is what I call development of the plumbing of vulnerability. So what the heck is plumbing? Well, plumbing is a way to move content, if you pardon the hokey metaphor, to move content from one place to another, right? So what is the content of vulnerability of our business? Well, it's the news about new IT vulnerabilities. It's things like security guidance and best practice and benchmarks. It's things that we create, that my group creates and lots of you create. Things like red team reports and blue team reports and tests on individual products and their flaws and incident reports. We're tracking what bad folks are doing to our networks and so forth. I call that the content of the vulnerability business. Most of those developed individually. Right? These are pieces of information that are created as an outgrowth of jobs that we all do. But think of them in a much more general sense as information that's all about the vulnerability of the environment. And this content is only valuable to the extent that we can move it somewhere else to solve the problem. Okay, so giving people red team reports is lovely, but what's the purpose of that? It's so that we understand the flaws in our network so we can manage them better. Right? So we need a way to translate what we learn in one dimension, the work that we do, into this different sphere of network management. So what's the plumbing? Well, the plumbing is starting to emerge. This is one set of standards. It's not all. But so plumbing, sort of standards and ways to express this content in a manner that is preferably open standard, available to all, supported by tools, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're familiar with some of these, CVE, Common Vulnerabilities Exposures, is the standard open naming scheme. The MITRE folks are right out the door, I think, down the hall here. OVAL, all of these we have, and our friends at MITRE and others have been involved with. Either we created or we sponsored or we worked with others to help create these things. Again, think of them as a way, so CVE, for example, the naming of vulnerabilities. When we've seen a new flaw, the goal as a community is to have a unique way to identify it and a way to communicate that uniquely and use it to link information together. So if you're familiar, and you really ought to be familiar with the National Vulnerability Database out of NIST, it's based upon CVE as actually the database key that links everything together. Right, so once you have a universal identifier, then you have a way to link cert advisories and bug track postings and all this information into one place. Okay. OVAL and these other things I won't go through, but you can find all this on the NIST website. But these are different kinds of standards, some of which are brand new, we've just put on the table, to help us organize the stuff or the output of the vulnerability business. I will mention XCCDF because it's a little more extensive. Extensible Common Checklist Description Format, I think. Sorry, that came from NSA. It's the next generation of security guidance. Okay, all the security guidance, benchmarks and so forth that I talked to you guys about. The old days, it was narrative. We recommend that you set this registry key to that value, okay, which evolved into, different kinds of documents, which evolved into plugins for specialty tools. Where should it evolve to? the modern model, right, an open standard XML. And so that's what XCCDF is. It's the next generation, the way that what we think will become the native language of security guidance. And once you move to an XML representation, you not only can send the guidance, but you can also send the security tests, for example. You can drag that along. You can drag along the documentation. You can do all kinds of really powerful things. So that could become the native expression of security guidance. All the advice givers have agreed to move in that direction. And it's a very powerful idea, I think, whose time has come. If you're interested in this again, there'll be a link at the end. There's a major workshop at NIST, September 19th and 20th, on security content automation. You can just Google on that, and you'll find links to that. And the ... at the bottom is because I think there's more standards to be developed yet. It's a very exciting time in this. And again, the level of cooperation has been very high. And if you don't know about these things, I'd really encourage you to look into them, because this has the attention of folks like the Office of Management Budget and the buyers and so forth. And many vendors, including many of you out here, already support some or all of these standards. But I want to give you a hint. There's kind of a bigger picture here. And then there's, of course, the fixtures, if you'll pardon me, straining the metaphor just one more time. So what do you get as these things emerge? Right? Well, you get a much more open environment for the tools of vulnerability management. And you get to link things together that weren't linked together before. So you'd like to be in a world where you take outputs from multiple tools, can correlate them, can integrate them, and use them to drive as inputs to other tools. For example, the simple examples from the vulnerability scanner to the patch manager. You'd like that to be done in an open way, because like in a complex environment like we deal a lot with the Army, they've got many different kinds of vulnerability scanners running, not one. And because they run a very complex worldwide network. And so they need multiple tools to manage that. And they need to be able to integrate the information across multiple tools in a manner to drive remediation and to deal with reporting and lots of other big issues. So there can't be a single model of how all this works. There has to be a way for these tools to interact. And then the notion of integrating reporting. So in a perfect world, and we're not there, but we're getting there, you take information you learn from a red team and integrate it with what you learn from the blue team, each of whom takes a dramatically different view of the network. And we'd integrate that with what sensors see for us as it's collecting data passing through, for example, gateways. And we pull all this information together. Well, of course we do it today. Right? We either buy all our tools from one vendor, or we ask poor human beings to integrate all this information. Right? So neither is an acceptable solution at the national level. And so we have to think about how can we have a world where this plumbing connects all these things together. So it's a much more powerful way to think about these problems. Okay, so plumbing. I mentioned earlier this Security Content Automation Program, the SCAP program. There's a lot going on there, but it's focused on things like automating compliance, the IT controls part of compliance, managing vulnerabilities, performing measurement, and so forth. So it's a evolving thing. It's very exciting, though, because the interest from the vendors and buyers has grown dramatically in the last year. The standards are maturing at different rates. Some are very mature, some are immature, frankly. So there's a lot of work to be done here yet. But it's very exciting in terms of the potential to build a framework for moving vulnerability information around. This is kind of the way that I've been thinking of this problem for some time. So you're welcome. I'll give you the link at the end for this website. Homed at NIST. Since we have a couple of minutes, I think. Yeah. Let me tell you kind of a parallel story. It's the way I've thought about the business for several years. It takes advantage of some of those standards. It's a little different thought about this. Across the bottom, I promise you no professional artists were used in the production of my group. None of your tax dollars were used in the professional, in the generation of these diagrams here for you. This is all me just dreaming this stuff up. But these are all jobs that my folks do. And we do lots more. But these are representative. Red teaming, you know what that is. Blue teaming. Operations, security, OPSEC. It's the what are we giving away for free, by the manner in which we conduct our operations, the patterns of our activity that adversaries can watch and see what we're doing. We have a group that it's actually a national level activity that helps train people in that and helps them set up their own operations security programs. ComSec monitoring is by permission from NSA. We work closely with the DoD in particular on monitoring open communications for stuff that we're giving away to bad guys for free through websites and through open email and voice and so forth. And technical security is about the physical environment that you work in. Right, so bugs and implants and that kind of world. We have teams that do sweeps and field testing and that sort of thing. Well, the reason I draw them down here, each of these jobs developed independently, right, for a different reason, history, under a different funding stream, with different human beings, all to solve a particular problem. And I draw them as little things like this, right? the old politically incorrect way to say, oh, these jobs were all in stovepipes. Of course, we're politically correct here, so we call these now cylinders of excellence. So cylinders of excellence means that these jobs developed, but there was really no communication between them. Right? In fact, these were highly polished cylinders of excellence, very brightly shining, because there was no reason to share. They were independent jobs being done. When this is where you are, right? When this is the businesses that you run, then your concern is over things like efficiency. Do we have the biggest, baddest red team in the DoD? And are we delivering? Can we do 20% more jobs next year than we did last year? And are all my people trained, et cetera, et cetera? And we became very focused on that, because each of these jobs came up differently. But, that wasn't good enough. So a few years ago, and again, we started to see this as a much broader problem. And so you're not going to solve this one network at a time through red team testing or product testing or field testing. So I asked the workforce to rethink this and refocus on community behavior, i.e. go find the other practitioners like us. So it's not, are we the biggest, baddest red team in the DoD? It's, who are the other red teams in the DoD? Why don't we work together? Right? Because they're going places that we can't. None of us is going to test the entire DoD. What can we do as a community? Right? And in many cases, I'll have to admit at NSA, we usually do have the biggest of any of these teams and the best resourced. So when you're the biggest, you have a responsibility to stand up and be the leader. Right? And so sometimes our leadership is codified in directives and national things, but a lot of times it's informal. And we're happy to follow too, by the way. But what do leaders do? What do communities do? Well, they gather together. They bring the people together in events like this, and they share lessons learned, and they swap tools, and they come up with standards of reporting, and they standardize their data, and they figure out how do we train people up to a certain level, and how do we calibrate across a bigger community. So that's what we started to do. So that took the form of community events, things like we host the major gathering of the red and blue teams across the DoD. If you've seen the press on something on the cyber defense exercise, we are the hosts for the hacking contest among the military service academies. We codify the training of the red teams across the DoD and set up tool sharing and now setting up standards for data output and so forth so information can be correlated. That's what you need to do when your focus is about a community, is about bringing people together. Right? And realizing that no one of us is going to solve this problem. It's much bigger than us. And by the way, what's the role of commercial friends in this? Can we spin off? And we have now several examples where we've taken kind of our methodology and spun it off in a way that you can go get trained and certified in. If it means anything to you, if you want to do certain jobs the NSA way, there are now ways to do that. Okay, and that has meaning in certain circles and other meanings in other places it doesn't. But it gives you a way to extend your leverage and your influence across a much broader community. So we started to think about this as community behaviors. But it was still primarily within these cylinders of excellence, right? We still really focused on how do we get better within our community. But again, that's not going to solve the problem. So about 4 years ago, or maybe a little longer, we started to think about, what's become everybody's favorite buzzword is integration. And my concern as a federal manager is I have all these unique sources of information. These are all dramatically different, unique, and really powerful and interesting sources. But they're a lot more interesting if I can bring them together. Right? What I see from red teaming is very dramatically different than others. It plays mock adversary, quietly comes in, but doesn't get to see what's really happening behind the firewall at any scale because it's too noisy. But the blue team gets to do that. And the blue team gets to figure out how is this IT being used to support critical operations for the Defense Department, for example. And the ComSec monitoring folks, they get to see, we just gave away information that would be critical information to support a red team scenario that a bad guy could exploit, and so forth. So there are lots of these examples that start to become clear. So how did we correlate this? Well, poor human beings tried to do it, right? And it's too hard. So as we started to bring that information together, what you get is, since each of these jobs develop separately, they speak a different language. So when red teamers talked about password policy, they used different terms than when the blue team spoke about it, than when the ComSec monitoring folks spoke about it. So then you have to put your best human beings in a room with stacks and stacks of paper trying to sort through that and reconcile it. Doesn't make any sense. So if you're going to integrate information, you need to start thinking of the problem differently. So the buzzword I came up with back then was what I call security sampling. All right, so let's stop thinking of this as just jobs that we do that we want to get better at. Again, we're not going to test our way to security in anything the scale of the DoD. So we want to think of this as, again, I have a daughter who's an English major. I paid good money for her tuition, so I always use metaphors whenever I can. Every time we touch the network, it's a sampling of the security in the DoD's networks. That became kind of the bumper sticker for us. So what's the purpose of sampling then? Well, the purpose of sampling is so we can draw conclusions about the underlying population, right? What's really going on out there? What's the most common problem? And what is the root cause? And how does it relate to other problems? And where's the best place in the life cycle to go tackle that problem? And one of the laws of security, I think, I'm not sure anyone's written this down, is that the optimal solution to security problems is almost never where you found them. Right? So when red teams find a problem and point it out in the operational environment, right, and they're very good folks, they'll tell you exactly what they did. They'll even give you the patch number from Microsoft to explain to you how to go find the patch and point you to the server. But if that network doesn't have a pretty strong way to manage configuration changes generally, that's not the place to solve this problem with that patch, right? It's at the network management level. So I think that's one of life's lessons here. So you have to think of sampling as the way we get to things like root cause and where do we solve this problem. So that became kind of the way we thought of this, sampling. So two things. You want to draw conclusions when you sample. Right? You want to help that one customer. Yes, absolutely you do. But the bottom line is the real powerful model is about security sampling. And then two, if you design your sampling framework cleverly enough, what happens? You don't have to do all the sampling. All your friends can work with you, right? And we can build kind of a scientific basis for integrating information across many different communities. Right? So that's the way we've come to think of this. And we use the buzz phrase integrated analysis and reporting, if you don't mind. That's the way we talk about it. But you got the idea. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm getting to be one of the truly old dudes in the computer security business. And so I get to pontificate. People ask me, what do you think and what you've seen change? And I'm not really that old. But here's a few of my life lessons. And I think they're illustrated in some of the things that I just talked about over the last half hour or so. You know, if we're going to deal with this problem at the national level, to gain assurance, to build confidence in what we're doing, these are sort of the intuitive things that have come out to me. One is about organizing the content generators, right? So stop thinking of us as individuals doing individual jobs. But how do we bring communities together? Because folks like you and folks like my folks, we are the original content generators in this business. We create unique things, unique information that can drive everything else. So you have to bring us together. A big part of that, though, is about standardizing the raw data. Right? This is a business that's been folklore and reading bug track and lots of really, we've outgrown that. It's too big now. The information is too vast, too dynamic, changes constantly, and matching problems with countermeasures, we can't do it through human being power alone. We really have to organize. And a lot of that's about standardizing the raw data. This notion of translating it into something useful upstream, think of those stakeholders and how do we think about this problem. Where's the right place to solve a given problem? It's often not in the realm of technology where we live. This business has been about who's going to invent the magic technology that will save us. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to have a mix of technology, but also operational practice and policy and training. We're going to have to do the whole range to make anything successful here. And then a key for me has been linking, this sort of geeky net management, security vulnerability stuff to other business areas. Things like network management, right? The purpose of red teaming is not because we want to do more red teaming. It's so we know what to do to manage our network more tightly. And so we have to think about how do I build an intellectual link to these other jobs so that becomes much more natural. And things like compliance. One reason I really got interested in compliance because it was just kind of irritating me, frankly, that so much money was going into that wasn't going into security, despite good intentions. So rather than fight against it, it's, well, how do I link it so that it does the right thing, so it makes much more sense? Okay? And then finally, wrap up with a sentence or two. One of the really exciting parts of my job is I get to deal a lot with folks outside of government and see things about government and the private sector and where we can find common ground. Like in all the things that I mentioned to you earlier, that was not a case of the government having the brilliant idea, showing up with a bag of money and telling people to do this. That's not the way this works. Anything I'm involved with, I try to do on the cheap. Because if we can't find common ground, then I probably haven't thought about this problem well enough. So it's about how does the government interact with the private sector more powerfully? So these are the lessons that I've learned. It's primarily about bringing content to the table. Right? The days of we're the government here to help you, we're here to organize you, that doesn't seem to work too well with this crowd. I know that won't work. It's about developing and bringing content to the table. You don't care for a government agency or Joe's Garage Shop or a multinational corporation. It's about what content are you bringing, and is it being delivered by good people, right? So when you meet my folks, I think you'll see your peers, people that are really smart and committed and live and breathe this business just like you guys do. And so that's a lot of it, is to realize we're not some mysterious place. We're really interesting folks who are doing really important work. So a lot of this is about equipping and organizing the rest of those stakeholders. I mentioned the different categories, in particular the buyers. So it's not the security weenies bag of money. It's the buyer's spending that really drives the behavior in this business. So you have to help the buyers find the right kind of things to demand security-wise. And then the last one's a little geeky, abstract the interfaces, which is, I'm always looking for those places where things talk to each other. Red teams talk to customers, for example, but vulnerability scanners talk to patch managers. Those are often places where the government needs to think, is that a good place that should be neutral and open and standards-based and so forth? So I'm always looking for those. So these are my quick life lessons about how we can interact better. It may surprise you or may not. In terms of public presence, my center at NSA is by far the most public technical organization you'll ever hear about. We've been mentioned, and yes, we've been mentioned favorably in the news in all these places in the last 6 months or 7 months or so. Most of it having to do with our release to the public of security guidance, our cooperation with Microsoft on the shift configuration of Vista, which you probably saw in the press and the Washington Post, and lots of other things. And we've also received recognition from a couple of national magazines recognizing our work in standards like XCCDF and so forth. So this is real culture shock for us at NSA. You don't come and stay at my place because you're in the public recognition business. But it's really gratifying because, again, our goal was to prove ourselves to be part of the community, to bring our part of the content to the table, and to provide an opportunity to work with folks like you. So let me close up. These are a few links about some of the things I mentioned that you're welcome to go take a look at. Let me thank you again for coming out to see me here and engage in this. I will be around for the rest of the week. As the flight attendants say, you had a choice this morning in your destination and the airline that you chose. You had a choice of keynotes this morning, so I really appreciate you taking most of an hour out of your valuable day to come see us. And on behalf of my great folks at NSA and the community that we work with, it's my pleasure to come speak with you today and share these stories. So thank you very much.